February 11th, 1952, 23 a.m. A desperate man with hate-filled tattoos and a stolen gun walked into the wrong store in the wrong neighborhood and made the worst mistake of his already doomed life. Charlie Cross Morrison thought he was robbing a helpless black woman. What he actually did was grab the wife of the most dangerous man in Harlem, and what happened next would be whispered in the streets for the next 70 years. 3 mistakes. That's all it took to seal Charlie Morrison's fate. Mistake 1, joining the KKK in Alabama, 1943. Mistake 2, killing a state trooper in Georgia, 1951. But mistake 3, that's the one that got him a scar across his throat and a front row seat to his own destruction. Because when you touch Bumpy Johnson's wife, you don't just face one man. You face an entire neighborhood. And on this cold February morning, 200 people were about to stand in absolute silence and watch justice served Harlem style. The fugitive's last gamble, 6 days. That's how long Charlie had been running since his prison break outside Valdosta. 6 days of freight trains, stolen clothes, and cheap whiskey to numb the terror eating at his gut. The electric chair was waiting for him back in Georgia, 3 months from his original execution date. But Canada was just a bus ride away if he could get the money, $500. That's all he needed. Enough for a ticket to Montreal, maybe Toronto. Start fresh with a new name where George's death warrant couldn't reach him. It should have been simple. Walk into some small shop, flash the gun, grab the cash, disappear into the crowd. But Charlie Morrison didn't understand New York. Didn't understand that when you're lost and desperate, you make stupid choices. And when he stumbled off that subway at 125th Street, looking around at faces that didn't look like his, hearing music that sounded foreign, seeing signs for businesses he'd never heard of, every instinct should have told him to get back on that train. Instead, he saw opportunity. A dress shop with nice clothes in the window. The kind of place that probably had real money in the register. And his cake-poisoned brain told him exactly what he wanted to hear. This would be easy. He was about to learn just how catastrophically wrong that assumption was. The Queen of Harlem, Mayme Johnson, wasn't just any woman running any shop. At 41, she'd survived the Great Migration, built a business from nothing, and spent 13 years married to a man whose very name made grown men check over their shoulders. She'd learned to read the streets, to spot trouble before it spotted her. So when Charlie Morrison pushed through her front door that morning, wild-eyed and desperate, hand inside his coat in that particular way that meant violence, Mayme didn't panic. She cataloged. White man, southern accent, prison pallor, stolen clothes, amateur criminal trying to look professional. Most importantly, he didn't know where he was. Empty the register, Charlie said, pulling out a Colt, the .45 that shook in his hands. Right now. Don't make me ask twice. Mayme looked at him with something Charlie couldn't quite identify. Not fear, not even anger, something closer to pity. Like she was watching a child about to stick his hand into a fire. You're not from here, she said calmly, voice steady as Sunday morning. I said empty the. I heard you. Mayme still hadn't moved toward the register. I'm just trying to understand. You're lost, aren't you? You don't know where you are. Charlie's anger spiked. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The gun usually made people scared, compliant. This woman was looking at him like he was some kind of curiosity. I know exactly where I am, he snarled. No, Mayme said quietly. You're in Harlem, on Lenox Avenue, and you walked into my shop. You pulled a gun on me. She paused, tilted her head slightly. Do you know who I am? Charlie didn't. That ignorance was about to cost him everything. I don't care who you are. You're about to be a dead woman if you don't. My name is Mayme Johnson, she interrupted. Does that name mean anything to you? It should have. In every speakeasy from 110th to 155th Street, in every policy bank, every numbers runner's office, every place where serious business was conducted in Harlem, there were 3 unbreakable rules. Don't steal from Bumpy's people. Don't disrespect Bumpy's territory. And never ever touch Bumpy's wife. Charlie had just shattered Rule 3, but the escaped convict from Alabama had no idea what he'd stumbled into. No idea that the calm woman standing 10 feet away was married to the most powerful man in Harlem. No idea that in grabbing her arm, threatening her life, he just declared war on an entire neighborhood. I don't care what your name is, Charlie said, stepping closer. Get the money now or I swear to God all. That's when Mayme said 5 words that should have made Charlie run. You just made a terrible mistake. The call that changed everything. What happened next defied every criminal instinct Charlie thought he understood. Instead of complying, instead of screaming, instead of begging, Mayme Johnson walked calmly to the front of her shop. She flipped the O-pen sign to closed. She locked the front door, drew the shade down over the window. Charlie watched, confused and increasingly panicked. "What are you doing?" "Buying you time," Mayme said simply. "A few hours at least. After that, well, we'll see." Then she walked to the telephone. Charlie could have stopped her, should have stopped her, but her bizarre calm had thrown him completely off balance. This wasn't how victims were supposed to behave. Mayme dialed, waited, someone picked up. "It's me," she said quietly. "I need you to tell him that the roses need watering. The shop closed early today." She hung up, turned back to Charlie, who was staring at her like she'd lost her mind. "What the hell was that? Who did you just call?" "Small's Paradise," Mayme replied. "That's a nightclub about 6 blocks from here. I left a message for my husband." Something cold twisted in Charlie's stomach. "Your husband?" "Ellsworth Johnson, though most people call him Bumpy." The name meant nothing to Charlie. He'd been locked up in Georgia, had no knowledge of New York's power structures, no understanding of who controlled what in Harlem. But if he'd been paying attention, if he'd had any street sense at all, he would have noticed how Mayme's voice changed when she said that name, like she was announcing the arrival of a hurricane. "I don't care who your husband is," Charlie said, trying to sound tough. "He shows up here, I'll shoot him too." Mayme actually smiled. Not a scared smile, not a desperate smile. A smile like she knew something Charlie didn't. "Oh honey," she said softly. "You really don't know where you are, do you?" The gathering storm within 30 minutes, word had spread through Harlem like wildfire, not through phones or official channels, but through the invisible network that connected every corner, every stoop, every shop in the neighborhood. Someone had a gun on Mrs. Johnson. Someone had threatened Bumpy's wife. By noon, Lenox Avenue was filling up. Not with a mob, not with angry protesters. Just people, neighbors, store owners who'd closed their shops, mothers with children, old men in their Sunday suits, working folks who'd left their jobs early. 200 people, standing quietly in the street, not shouting, not making demands, just present, bearing witness. The police had arrived within minutes of the first 911 call. 3 cars, 6 officers, standard hostage response protocol. They'd tried to establish contact, set up a perimeter, clear the area of civilians. But the civilians wouldn't clear. "Folks, you need to step back," Sergeant Murphy kept saying. "This is an active hostage situation. You're interfering with police operations." An elderly woman in a church hat and carrying a Bible looked at him like he was simple. "We're not interfering, officer. We're witnessing." "Mom, I'm ordering you to. This is our neighborhood." Another voice called out, a man in a butcher's apron. "That's Mrs. Johnson in there. We're not leaving until we know she's safe." Captain William Henderson showed up 20 minutes later, took one look at the crowd, and realized this wasn't a situation that could be solved with standard police procedures. You couldn't arrest 200 people, couldn't drag them away without starting a riot. And Henderson had been working Harlem long enough to understand the politics here were complicated. He'd been on Bumpy's payroll for years. Not much money, just enough to look the other way when certain businesses operated, just enough to make sure certain people got a phone call when raids were being planned. It was how things worked, and it worked because Bumpy, unlike other criminals, actually kept the neighborhood safer. Less random violence, less chaos. As long as Bumpy was in charge, Harlem was manageable. But this was different. This was someone threatening Bumpy's wife in Bumpy's territory. Henderson had seen what happened to people who made that mistake. He'd seen the bodies, written the reports, filed them away and never asked questions. Inside the storm for 4 hours, Charlie Morrison lived in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Police surrounding the building. A hostage negotiator trying to talk him into surrender. And through it all, Mayme Johnson sitting calmly like she was waiting for a bus. "Why aren't you scared?" Charlie finally asked around 2 p.m. Mayme looked at him. "Because this ends the same way no matter what you do. The only question is whether you're smart enough to surrender before my husband gets here." "I told you I don't care about your..." "You should," Mayme interrupted. "Bumpy Johnson is the most powerful man in Harlem. He's killed men for less than this. And you grabbed his wife, put a gun to her head in his own neighborhood." She paused. "Let that sink in. Charlie, right? That's what the police said your name is." Charlie Morrison, KKK member, escaped convict on death row for killing a state trooper. Charlie's eyes widened. "How do you?" "The negotiator told me. Thought it might help me understand who I was dealing with." Mayme's voice was almost gentle now. "Charlie, you're already a dead man. Georgia wants to execute you. You've got maybe 3 months before they strap you into that electric chair. So you've got nothing to lose, right? That's what you're thinking. Charlie didn't respond, but here's what you're not thinking about. Mayme continued quietly. There are different ways to die. George's electric chair, that's quick. 2,000 volts, you're gone in seconds. But my husband, she paused. He's not quick. He's patient and creative. And if you hurt me, if you put one more bruise on my arm, he will make sure your last hours on earth are so much worse than anything Georgia could do to you. You're bluffing? Am I? Mayme looked at him steadily. You want to find out? At 3:42 p.m. the phone in the shop rang. The king arrives, Morrison. Captain Henderson's voice was tight on the phone. This is your lucky day. We've worked out a deal. Safe passage to the Canadian border, new identity, witness protection. Charlie's heart leaped. Maybe this nightmare was finally. There's just one condition, Henderson continued. You need to let Mrs. Johnson go right now. Not because of the law, because her husband just arrived. The blood drained from Charlie's face. What? Bumpy Johnson is here. He's standing in the street. And Morrison, I've worked in Harlem for 15 years. I've seen what this man does to people who cross him. You're already on death row. Don't make your last days on earth worse than they have to be. Let her go. Surrender. At least that way it's fast. You're bluffing. Look out the window. Charlie moved to the shade, keeping the gun pressed against Mayme's head, and peered through a gap. The crowd had parted down the middle, creating a path from the street to the shop door. And walking down that path, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned every inch of ground he stepped on, was Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. He was smaller than Charlie had expected. 5'9", maybe 170 pounds, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit, fedora, shoes polished like mirrors. He looked like a businessman heading to a meeting. Except for his eyes. Charlie had seen that look before, in the eyes of lifers in Georgia State Prison. Men who'd killed so many times that murder didn't even register as significant anymore. Cold, empty, like looking into the eyes of a predator. Bumpy stopped 10 feet from the shop door, reached into his jacket. Every cop tensed, hands moving toward weapons. Bumpy didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a straight razor. Old-fashioned, the kind barbers used. The kind that could shave a man's face smooth or open his throat from ear to ear. He opened the razor with a practiced flick of his wrist. Click. That sound carried across the silent street like a gunshot. Metal on metal, sharp, final. Bumpy looked directly at the window where he knew Morrison was watching. Then he turned to Captain Henderson. Captain. Bumpy's voice was quiet, but in the silence of that street, everyone heard every word. I'm going to give you some advice. In about 2 minutes, I'm going through that door. What happens after that? You don't want your officers to witness. Or Mr. Johnson, this is a police matter. I can't just... You can... Bumpy interrupted. Still quiet, still calm. You can tell your men to maintain a perimeter but hold position. You can tell them that if they hear anything, they wait 30 seconds before entering. 30 seconds, Captain. That's all I need. Henderson looked at the crowd. 200 silent witnesses. Then he looked at Bumpy Johnson and made a calculation that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with survival. Officers, Henderson called out, fall back to the end of the block. Maintain visual on the building, but do not approach unless I give the order. Captain, we can't just. That's an order. The cops retreated reluctantly, far enough that they couldn't see clearly through the shop's windows, far enough that they could later claim they didn't witness what happened next. The crowd didn't move. 8 seconds. Bumpy walked to the shop door. Tried the handle, locked. He stepped back, called toward the window. Morrison, you've got 2 choices. Choice 1, you open this door right now. Let my wife walk out unharmed, not a hair on her head touched. You do that, I let Captain Henderson arrest you. You go back to Georgia. They execute you clean quick. You don't suffer. Bumpy paused. Let that sink in. Choice 2, I come through this door myself. And before you go back to Georgia, you spend a few days in a Harlem hospital wishing you'd chosen option 1. Inside the shop, Charlie was hyperventilating. He's bluffing, Charlie whispered to Mayme. He won't. He can't just. He's not bluffing, Mayme said quietly. And Charlie, listen to me. You're a dead man already. Georgia is going to execute you whether you surrender now or in a week. The only question is what happens between now and then. Charlie looked at her, looked at the door, looked at the gun in his shaking hand. He thought about Alabama, about the Clen meetings where they talked about superiority, about keeping people in their place with fear and violence. He thought about how catastrophically wrong all of that had been. I can't go back, Charlie said, his voice breaking. I can't. That chair. You're going back either way, Mayme said, but you can go back in one piece. Outside, Bumpy was done waiting. He took 3 steps back from the door. Then he ran forward and kicked it just beside the lock. The door exploded inward, wood splintering, lock mechanism ripping free from the frame. Charlie spun toward the sound, tried to aim the gun at the doorway. Bumpy was already inside, moving faster than a man his age should move. The razor was open in his hand, glinting in the dim light. No! Charlie screamed, pulled the trigger. Click. The stolen army surplus pistol jammed. The slide frozen halfway back, a spent cartridge stuck in the ejection port. Charlie stared at the useless gun in his hand for 1 frozen second. That second cost him everything. What happened next took exactly 8 seconds, but would be retold in Harlem for the next 70 years. Bumpy closed the distance in 2 steps. His left hand shot out like a striking snake, grabbed Charlie's wrist, twisted until Charlie screamed and the jammed pistol clattered to the floor. His right hand, the one holding the razor, came up in one smooth, practiced motion. The blade opened a precise line across Charlie's throat. Not deep, not killing, but enough to send a message. One clean cut from left jaw to right, about 2 inches below his chin. Deep enough to bleed heavily, deep enough to hurt like hell, deep enough to scar permanently. But not deep enough to kill. That's for putting your hands on my wife, Bumpy said quietly. Charlie clutched his throat, blood pouring between his fingers. His eyes were wide with shock and terror and pain. Bumpy stepped back, wiped the razor blade on Charlie's stolen jacket, closed it with a practiced flick, and slipped it back into his pocket. You fine? He asked Mayme. I'm fine. Bumpy turned back to Charlie, who'd slid down the wall into a sitting position, both hands pressed against his throat. Morrison. Bumpy's voice was still quiet. Look at me. Charlie looked up, blood running down his forearms. You came to Harlem today thinking it'd be easy. You got lost, ended up in a neighborhood you didn't understand, walked into a black woman's shop, and figured you could take what you wanted because you had a gun and she didn't. Bumpy crouched down, eye level with Charlie now. You were wrong about all of that, and that cut on your throat. That's your lesson. That's what you remember for however many days you've got left. You remember the day you learned that hate isn't armor, a gun isn't power, and some women have husbands who walk through police lines to protect them. Justice served cold. Bumpy stood, walked to the door, called toward the street. Captain Henderson, Morrison's ready for arrest. He needs medical attention. Cut on his throat. Superficial, but it's bleeding pretty good. He'll live long enough to get back to Georgia. Henderson appeared in the doorway, 2 officers behind him. They looked at Charlie bleeding on the floor. Looked at Bumpy standing there calm and collected. Looked at the jammed pistol in the corner. What happened here, Mr. Johnson? Morrison tried to attack my wife with that letter opener when I came through the door, Bumpy said, pointing to a decorative brass letter opener on Mayme's desk. I disarmed him, had to defend her. Things got physical. The story was weak. Everyone in that room knew it. But Henderson understood what Bumpy was offering, a story that explained the blood without requiring anyone to admit what had really happened. I see, Henderson said slowly. And you're certain that's what occurred? Absolutely certain. Mrs. Johnson, can you confirm your husband's account? Mayme didn't hesitate. That's exactly what happened, Captain. Charlie grabbed that letter opener and came at me. My husband stopped him. Thank God he arrived when he did. 2 officers hauled Charlie to his feet, started dragging him toward the door. Charlie was crying now, from pain, from fear, from the crushing realization that he'd nearly died and only Bumpy Johnson's decision to let him live had saved him. As they pulled him past, Bumpy spoke one last time, voice quiet enough that only Charlie could hear. Morrison, you've got maybe 3 months before Georgia straps you into that chair. And every single day until then, when you see that scar in the mirror, you remember what you learned in Harlem. You remember that you came here thinking hate made you strong, and you met someone who showed you what real strength looks like. The legend lives on. Charlie Morrison was executed by electrocution at Reedsville State Prison on May 15, 1952. He was 28 years old. The guards later said that as they strapped him into the chair, Morrison kept touching the scar on his throat over and over, like he was trying to remember something. One guard asked him about it. That scar from your escape? Morrison looked at him, smiled sadly. No, that's from when I learned my lesson. Too bad it came too late. The story of what happened at Mayme's dress shop became legend in Harlem. The details got exaggerated over the years, as stories do. Some versions said Bumpy kicked the door completely off its hinges. Some said the razor cut was so precise it looked surgical. Some said the crowd was 1,000 people strong. But the core truth remained constant. A KKK member walked into Harlem thinking he could victimize a black woman because he had a gun and she didn't. He learned a lesson that cost him a permanent scar and ultimately cost him his life. Because in Harlem 1952, when you touched Bumpy Johnson's wife, you didn't just face one man. You faced an entire neighborhood. You faced 200 people who understood that some lines can't be crossed. And sometimes, justice doesn't come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a man in a gray suit with a straight razor and the absolute certainty that protecting his family means more than any law ever written. That's why they called him the Godfather of Harlem. That's why his legend endures. And that's why even today old-timers still tell the story of the day a racist made the worst mistake of his life, and 200 people stood in complete silence to watch him pay for it. The aftermath ripples through Harlem. The story didn't end when Charlie Morrison was dragged away in handcuffs. In fact, that's when it really began. Within hours, every speakeasy, every policy bank, every corner barbershop in Harlem was buzzing with the details. How Bumpy had walked through a police line like it was nothing. How he'd moved faster than a man half his age. How he'd made his point with surgical precision and walked away without so much as a speck of blood on his gray suit. But more than the violence, people talked about the control. The way Bumpy had turned what could have been a bloodbath into a lesson. The way he'd given Morrison exactly what he deserved. No more, no less. That's what separates a king from a killer, said old Pete Williams, who'd watched the whole thing from his barbershop window. Any fool with a gun can take a life. It takes a real man to know when not to. The police, for their part, filed their reports and forgot about them. Henderson's version, Morrison attacking with a letter opener, Bumpy defending his wife, went into the official record without challenge. The photos showed a superficial throat wound consistent with a struggle over a brass letter opener. Case closed. The FB field office in New York received a copy of the report as part of their ongoing surveillance of organized crime figures in Harlem. Agent Thomas Redley read it twice, then picked up his phone. "Sir, we've got a situation in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson just made a very public statement." "What kind of statement?" "The kind that makes him untouchable. We've got 200 witnesses who'll swear he acted in self-defense. A police captain who's backing his story, and a dead man walking who learned the hard way what happens when you cross Johnson in his own neighborhood." There was silence on the other end. Finally, recommendation. Leave it alone. Johnson just proved he can mobilize half of Harlem with a phone call. The last thing we need is to turn him into a folk hero by going after him for protecting his wife from a KKK killer. The FB file on the Morrison incident was marked, closed, no further action, and buried in a cabinet where it would remain for the next 30 years. The psychology of power. What most people misunderstood about that February day was that it wasn't really about Charlie Morrison at all. Morrison was just the unlucky messenger, the fool who'd stumbled into a situation bigger than himself. The real message was for everyone else. Every small-time criminal who thought Harlem was soft territory. Every racist who thought black folks wouldn't fight back. Every cop who thought they could push Bumpy around. The message was simple: touch what's mine, and I'll touch you back. Harder. Dr. Kenneth Washington, a psychiatrist who'd grown up in Harlem and later wrote extensively about neighborhood power structures, analyzed the Morrison incident in his 1967 book, Urban Kingdoms. Johnson's response was perfectly calibrated. Washington wrote, "Too little, and he looks weak. His enemies multiply. Too much, and he becomes a target for federal intervention. But this was just right. Public enough to send a message. Violent enough to be memorable, controlled enough to be legal." The doctor interviewed dozens of Harlem residents for his book. Their responses were remarkably consistent. "Bumpy didn't just protect his wife that day," said Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, who'd been in the crowd outside the shop. "He protected all of us. He showed that Harlem isn't a place where outsiders can just come in and take what they want." James Quick Parker, a numbers runner worked for one of Bumpy's competitors, put it differently. "Man proved he wasn't just talk." All these years, people wondering if Bumpy still had it, if he was getting soft. That cake boy found out real quick. Bumpy Johnson don't get soft. The economic impact, what the newspapers didn't report, what the police files didn't mention, was how the Morrison incident affected business in Harlem. In the weeks following February 11th, crime in the neighborhood dropped by 30%. Stick-up artists who'd been targeting local businesses suddenly found other places to work. The protection rackets that had been muscling in on Bumpy's territory quietly retreated. Store owners noticed the change immediately. Mrs. Sarah Collins, who ran a grocery store 2 blocks from Mayme's dress shop, saw her shoplifting problems disappear overnight. Word got around real fast. She said years later, "You mess with Harlem's people, you answer to Bumpy." And after what happened to that Morrison boy, nobody wanted those answers. The numbers racket, Bumpy's primary source of income, saw a surge in participation. People wanted to be associated with the man who'd stood up to the KKK. Policy runners reported record sales for 3 months straight. It was respect, pure and simple, explained Willie Numbers Thompson, who worked Lenox Avenue for Bumpy. Folks saw what happened to that white boy, and they understood they were dealing with the real thing. Not some street corner tough guy, but a man who'd walk through hell to protect what's his. The social revolution, the Morrison incident, came at a crucial time in Harlem's development. The neighborhood was caught between 2 worlds. The old guard who remembered when white folks could do whatever they wanted to black folks without consequence, and a new generation that was starting to demand respect. Bumpy's response to Morrison became a symbol of that change. Here was a black man who didn't run, didn't hide, didn't defer to white authority. He stood his ground, protected his family, and made the aggressor pay the price. The Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Harlem's congressman and most prominent political figure, understood the significance immediately. Though he couldn't publicly endorse vigilante justice, his next Sunday's sermon included some pointed remarks about standing up to those who would intimidate our community. "There comes a time," Powell told his congregation, "when a man must choose between being a victim and being a victor. Our neighborhood has made its choice." The NAP had a more complicated response. Publicly, they condemned violence as a solution to racial problems. Privately, many members admitted that Bumpy had done what the courts couldn't, shown a racist that his beliefs had consequences. "We don't advocate Johnson's methods," said local NAP chapter president Gertrude Marcus Webb, "but we understand his motivations. When the legal system fails to protect our people, they will protect themselves." The ripple effect nationwide word of the Morrison incident spread far beyond Harlem. Black newspapers across the country picked up the story, often embellishing the details but keeping the core message intact. A black man had faced down the cake and won. The Pittsburgh Courier ran the headline, "Harlem Hero Stops Cake Killer." The Chicago Defender's version was, "Bumpy Johnson Shows Racists Who's Boss." In Birmingham, where the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, protesters adopted "Remember Morrison" as a rallying cry. The message was clear: resistance works. In Little Rock, where school integration battles were heating up, black families took inspiration from Bumpy's stand. If one man could face down hate in New York, maybe they could face it in Arkansas. The story even reached international audiences. The Amsterdam News, which had correspondents in London and Paris, reported that European papers were fascinated by the story of an American gangster who'd become a folk hero by standing up to white supremacists. The price of protection, but power comes with a price, and Bumpy Johnson was about to learn just how expensive his reputation had become. Federal attention intensified. The FB opened a new file on Johnson, this one focusing not just on his criminal activities but on his growing influence as a folk hero. J. Edgar Hoover himself reviewed the Morrison incident report and made a note: "Johnson is becoming a symbol of black resistance. This could be dangerous." The Internal Revenue Service suddenly became very interested in Bumpy's finances. How does a man with no official income afford tailored suits and a Cadillac? Agents started appearing at businesses throughout Harlem, asking questions about Bumpy's role in the community. Local competitors saw opportunity in the increased scrutiny. If the feds could take down Bumpy, that would leave a power vacuum that someone would have to fill. Meetings were held in back rooms, plans were made, alliances were formed, but they all underestimated one crucial factor: the Morrison incident had made Bumpy more than just a criminal boss. It had made him a protector, a symbol, an idea. And ideas are much harder to kill than men. The long game. Bumpy understood the shifting landscape better than his enemies gave him credit for. The Morrison incident had been a tactical victory, but it had also raised the stakes. Every move he made now would be watched, analyzed, used against him. So he did something unexpected. He became more legitimate. Investment in local businesses increased. Scholarships for neighborhood kids appeared. Community organizations found themselves with mysterious benefactors. Bumpy was building something larger than a criminal empire. He was building a legacy. After Morrison, said longtime Harlem resident James Baldwin in a 1965 interview, Bumpy became something different. Not just a gangster, but a protector. Not just a boss, but a king. And that changed everything. The message was clear then, and it's clear now. You can walk into Harlem, but if you disrespect it, you won't walk out the same. And sometimes you don't walk out at all. But the real lesson of February 11th, 1952, wasn't about violence or revenge. It was about community, about standing up for your own, about the difference between power and strength. Charlie Morrison came to Harlem with a gun and hate in his heart. He met a man who had something more powerful, the respect and loyalty of an entire neighborhood. That's what 200 people were really witnessing that day. Not just one man's justice, but a community's strength. Not just Bumpy Johnson's power, but Harlem's soul. And that's a lesson that echoes through the decades, reminding us that true strength doesn't come from weapons or hatred, but from the bonds we build and the courage to defend what matters most. In the end, Charlie Morrison got exactly what he deserved. And Bumpy Johnson, he got exactly what he'd always fought for: respect. The kind of respect that lasts forever. The kind of respect that makes legends. The kind of respect that, even today, makes people remember the day a KKK member grabbed the wrong woman's arm and learned what happens when you mess with Harlem's king. Epilogue: the last word. 70 years later, visitors to Harlem can still find traces of that February day. Mayme's dress shop is long gone, replaced by a coffee shop that serves organic fare. Trade lats to young professionals who have no idea what happened on that corner. But the older residents remember. They remember because some stories are too important to forget, too powerful to let die with the people who lived them. Mrs. Geneva Washington, now 89, was 17 years old when she stood in that crowd of 200. She still lives in Harlem, in the same apartment building where she was born. People ask me why we didn't just let the police handle it. She says, rocking slowly in her chair by the window. They don't understand. In 1952, the police weren't there to protect us. They were there to control us. But Bumpy was there to protect us. She points to a faded photograph on her wall, a young woman in a 1950s dress standing outside a shop. Behind her, barely visible in the background, is a crowd of people. That's me, she says, right there in the middle of history. The day we learned that respect goes both ways. The lessons of that day continue to resonate. In a world where hate still rears its ugly head, where communities still struggle against forces that would divide and conquer them, the story of Bumpy Johnson and Charlie Morrison serves as a reminder. Sometimes justice comes from courtrooms and judges. Sometimes it comes from men in gray suits with straight razors and the absolute certainty that protecting family means everything. And sometimes it comes from 200 people standing in silence, bearing witness to the moment when evil meets its match. That's the real power of the story. Not the violence, not the blood, but the community. The understanding that when one of us is threatened, all of us are threatened. When one of us stands up, all of us stand up. Charlie Morrison thought he was robbing a random black woman. Instead, he challenged an entire neighborhood. He thought he had a gun and advantage. Instead, he learned that some things are more powerful than weapons. He thought he understood power. Instead, he met strength. The kind of strength that doesn't come from hate or fear, but from love and loyalty and the unbreakable bonds that tie a community together. That's the lesson Harlem taught the world on February 11th, 1952. That's the legacy of Bumpy Johnson. And that's why even now the story continues to be told. Because some truths are timeless, some lessons never get old, and some legends never die. They just wait for the next generation to learn what happens when you mess with family. What happens when you mess with Harlem? What happens when you mess with a king? The answer is always the same: you learn. One way or another you learn. Charlie Morrison learned the hard way, and for 70 years his story has been teaching others. The lesson is simple, but it bears repeating: respect is earned, not taken. Power is used to protect, not intimidate. And sometimes, justice comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it comes from a man in a gray suit who loved his wife enough to walk through hell to protect her. Sometimes it comes from a community that loved itself enough to stand together in silence. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky and very wrong, it comes with a razor's edge and a scar you'll carry to the grave. That's the story of February 11th, 1952. The day a KKK member grabbed Bumpy Johnson's wife and learned what happens when hate meets love. When fear meets courage. When a coward meets a king. The rest, as they say, is history. The kind of history that Harlem will never forget. The kind of history that keeps teaching us one story at a time.